Hi there, Adam Chalice from JLL. I run the Capital Markets Research and Strategy function for EMEA. There's a really great couple of speakers that I will ask to introduce in a moment. Really focusing for the next 40 minutes or so, 35 minutes or so on changes that are shaping the housing market, and with Yael as chief economist at KPMG, and Neil Hudson, who many of you will know, with a really keen eye on what is happening in the residential market. Some really, I think, preeminent voices to be able to help opine on what we're seeing out there in the housing market in the UK. So we'll start with just short little opening statements from each, and I'll add mine perhaps at the end, and then we've got a few questions that I'll moderate. Thanks very much to the BPF for convening this group, and Yael, I wonder if you could just perhaps provide some opening framing comments from the broader economics perspective on the UK housing market.
Sure, thank you, Adam, and good morning, everyone. So I'll start by saying that, first of all, the good news is that the recession and crisis, if you like, that we're going through at the moment was triggered by a health shock. And I think that is quite significant still to bear in mind, because what it means is that the overall health of the economy was relatively good. We didn't have any major business misalignment that caused this recession. And that means that, at least everything else being equal, we should have a faster recovery than otherwise. So the big question now is how deep this recession is going to be. We've already had some data for April and March, and that shows that we have the lockdown measure, which is a very extreme measure that effectively put us in a coma for a few months, meant that output contracted very, very sharply in the beginning of Q2. But we've also had some data on employment this morning, and that shows that we've actually, apart from the climate count measure that has a few things there that would make it a little bit higher, we haven't actually seen the full impact of these measures, social distancing measures and lockdown yet, because we had the government stepping in very aggressively with the job retention scheme and other programs to try and protect the economy while we're in this hibernation mood. So the big question now is how long this crisis is going to be, how long the pandemic is going to last, and therefore how long we're actually going to have actual damage into the economy beyond this lockdown lull, if you like. And that will depend a lot on different sectors, but will also depend a lot on when the pandemic ends. At the moment, we're expecting the pandemic to end only potentially next year. So we potentially still have about a year to go before the end of all of it. And that means that we would potentially see unemployment picking up quite significantly in the UK once the job retention scheme ends in October, and even potentially before that, even from July, when it starts to unwind. And then when you think about the housing market, that obviously poses a risk. So as an economist, the way I see the housing market, I see interest rates are going to remain very low for a very long time. So that provides some support. Also, in terms of overall valuation, we've seen valuations that are relatively fair compared to historic, except for a few parts of the UK. But the big question mark is the unemployment market, and whether that could trigger a significant recession. And also, it's not just the unemployment, it's all the uncertainty around the situation at the moment. So I'd say that, if you like, the elephant in the room from my perspective, because it will have a big implication for the UK economy as a whole. And then beyond that, there's probably a few pockets of housing market areas where I'd be a little bit more concerned, if you like, in the longer term. One of them is student housing, because we will likely to see more permanent changes to students coming to the UK because of this, but because of other things that are happening. And the other one is offices and commercial property more generally, where I think we are likely to see major alignment there. So I'll just stop it here.
Yeah, really helpful, Yael, and of course trying to box in a whole wide range of effects across the economy in a few minutes is always a challenge, but I know that you're well practiced at it. We've all had to become amateur epidemiologists along the way as well. So I wonder, Neil, whether I could draw you in now just to dial us back more directly into a UK housing market specific lens, the impacts that you're seeing and some of the concerns and risks that are on the near horizon.
Yeah, sorry, I was just getting an unstable connection there. Hopefully I'm coming through all right now. So good morning. And yes, the housing market, it appears to have picked up where it was prior to the lockdown. Estate agents, Rightmove, Zoopla, everyone are shouting about record high demand, and we're probably seeing record high misuse of the term demand as well. But there's certainly a lot of interest from people when they're looking at property, and the stats that we've seen so far suggest that sales subject to contracts are back to where they were at this time last year. So, and that's from having been running at about 10% of previous levels during the actual lockdown. So we're back into a period. There's a bit of mixed messages coming through on the house price indices, nationwide pointing downwards. The Rightmove asking prices are pointing upwards, and so it's a bit of an uncertain market, and it's quite challenging to actually identify exactly what's going on. But when you look kind of much more deeply, there appears to be a bit of a return to the pre-2013 housing market, where your ability to access the housing market is highly dependent on your levels of equity and your having a high job and being able to save the deposit. And so a lot of the stats that we're seeing so far, albeit some of them are partially anecdotal, is that the higher priced parts of the market appear to be doing much better, and particularly the markets outside of London. And so that's a trend we're going to see continuing. And the real key question is actually tying it back into the economy and all the economic indicators, is when will the effects of this massive economic shock actually feed through into the housing market? And the key questions there are around the furlough scheme, the timing of that when it ends, but also around mortgage holidays and around just general mortgage lenders' forbearance and how long and willing they are to exert that. So we could see a slightly weird market over the summer where things continue, albeit at lower transaction levels than the 1.2 million we've tended to see over the last few years. But then the autumn or possibly the spring next year is when I suspect we'll begin to see the real impact of the crisis feeding through.
Yeah, Neil, really helpful. Thank you. And I think just before Alex Greaves has now joined, managed to break through the technical barriers, and we'll pick up the moderator ball in a moment. But I'll perhaps just round off the comments with my own views for a couple of minutes, and the perspective that I have, which really looks across the real estate spectrum, and the theme that I think both of you touched on around timing is really crucial. Of course, if you look at one end of the spectrum, we've seen hotels and hospitality effectively go off a cash cliff with immediate cessation of trading and cash flows converging towards nil. Moving through the retail space, which was already under its structural decline and perhaps accelerated in some respects, at least the physical retail environment, as a result of technology adoption and COVID-19 behavior responses. The office space, and there's in fact I think a really important and fascinating question that's playing out around office space, particularly as it relates to living in our new work from home environments. The surveys that we've done, and plenty of others, but the JLL surveys show that clearly there's interest in greater flexible working, and the real challenge for corporates will be, of course, a response to preserve corporate culture and to create environments that really encourage the workforce to remain participants, remain highly productive and valued loyal members of the team. And so the implications on office square footage remains, I think, an open question. But I think, just returning to the point around timing, what's really important for me is that a lot of the prognostications that are coming out now, and then we've moved through, if you like, the colloquial eye of the storm, but still feeling very much the near-term pain effects of COVID-19. A lot of the thinking now is hugely important, but may not be a very good representation of what medium and long-term implications are likely to flow through. And I say that, and perhaps just elaborating on it by thinking about a few examples. The 1918 Spanish flu pandemic was followed, of course, by the Roaring Twenties, and we'll have all seen videos where social distancing didn't look like it was playing out very much, and certainly Mr. Gatsby's world and others. So that you can think about a pivot back to a different way of living, or more quote unquote normal way of living, using that more direct comparable. More recently, you think about adoption of internet and email, and urban commentators like all of us would have talked a lot about the death of distance. Yet what happened since that time? We became more urbanized. We became more focused on living in cities and higher densities, and so clearly that didn't come to pass either. And even when you think about a big shock to Western economies like 9/11, at the time, commentators talked about the end of tall buildings for living or for working, and yet we built more tall buildings since 9/11 than we had through history up to that point. So while history is a really important teacher and really important to provide us with trend lines around the direction of travel in future, I think what we're far more likely to see is the acceleration of some of the existing trends. And the two most important for me are around technology adoption. This is, of course, a very good example, and the acceleration of technology adoption as a way of lubricating the life that we want to have. Technology isn't the end; it's a contributor to our functioning in society. And the other really important one is sustainability, and the acceleration of sustainability and the whole range of sustainable technologies that will be brought to bear in real estate terms, and in a really rounded sense, where sustainability has traditionally meant, or has been a default often, to environmental sustainability. Clearly what we're seeing now is in ESG, the social element being far more important, taking care of each other and taking care of our work environments and our health, and governance, good, prudent governance that ensures that businesses are more resilient going forward. So I think about the acceleration of existing trends as being at least as important as what might be, quote unquote, net new as a result of the COVID-19 impact. Alex, I think I can now hand back to you to pick up the ball. I hope I've stepped in and done a reasonably competent job in your absence.
Thank you, Adam. Can the three of you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Fantastic, thank you. Adam, thank you very much for stepping in and doing that. There's now a 7-year-old girl in our household who's very unhappy that her father has pinched a computer, talking of technology, and not being able to get into our, working for a FTSE 25, you'd think that our technology would allow us to do a call in this format, but it turns out it's changed. Very helpful. I take it you've done the introduction sort of 5-minute sessions each, so thank you for doing that. There are some questions that have come through on the Q&A already, and I don't know if the three of you have had a chance to do that, but what I'm going to do is just sort of go on to the first discussion topic from the notes that I've got, and I will start harvesting there's some really good questions that have come in on there, so I'd urge you to read them whilst I'm speaking now, then you can have a think about what the answers might be. Previously you've already indicated that what's unusual about this in comparison to previous recessions is that this is not a housing-led recession. and this time round, housing is a bystander. And what's likely to happen as a result of it being a bystander? So what are your views on how events might play out over the next year in particular? So the three of you, I know you're crystal ball gazers, so I think if you can look into your crystal balls and come up with the perfect solution for those people listening in, what's going to happen for both the economy and the housing market? And does a non-housing led economy, non-housing led recession, I mean, even more impact on regional housing markets? Or could we end up in a situation where we get a double recession, one led by the impact of COVID, which then leads to the recession within housing, which then leads on to a further one? So I don't know who would like to go first. I know our original order was Adam, Yael, and then Neil. So Adam, would you like to take, I know you've done a lot of talking already, would you like to go first, or would you like to give it to one of your colleagues?
Yeah, I'm happy to provide a couple of thoughts. I think centrally that that question will probably fall to Yael. I'm certainly hoping it will, but a few thoughts from me. Clearly, the housing market is a really important driver or follower of a broader economic activity. And Neil made the point quite rightly that the furloughing scheme, in effect, has given us a false floor under consumer sentiment, particularly as it relates to housing affordability, because we have not really got enough clarity on the underlying structural scarring from COVID-19, the economic, the structural impacts from COVID-19. And that will, of course, start to flow through over the next couple of months as people do or don't return to work from furloughing. Clearly, that will also directly relate to the extent to which we're able to continue to manage the health impacts. The health impacts start to tick back up, that second spike that people often refer to, and the economic effects become materially worse. And I think that includes a tick up in unemployment. If we look to the US, maybe there's some indicators of positivity there, that the storyline around people returning to work is not as bad as perhaps might have expected, against clearly an enormous spike in unemployment, an unprecedented spike in unemployment in the United States. But I'd also argue that story is still premature. There's still a lot more that we need to learn about the underlying impacts, the scarring, as I referred to, on the economy. And all of that will then shape ultimately the trajectory for the housing market. So that that early positive response that we've seen has been, of course, encouraging, but I don't think it really tells us much about the medium to long-term story just yet.
We've got, on one hand, we've got a group of people who are in exactly the same financial position that they were in prior to the lockdown, possibly even better. They've been sat at home, they've not been going out, they've not been spending money, so they may even have got more money than they had previously. And those people are able to go out into the housing market at the moment and bid for a property at exactly the same price as they were 3 or 4 months ago. And it looks like quite a large number of them are. On the other hand, we've got a load of people who have been horrifically hit by this economic downturn. They've lost lost wages, they've lost savings, they've lost jobs. And that's not even before we get into the people who've actually lost their lives as well. And so we've got effectively this divergence between some people who are doing absolutely fine and some people who are doing absolutely terrible, with obviously a broad mix of people in the middle. And so the housing market prior to the lockdown was well priced at a UK level, though I think Yael mentioned earlier, there were some regional variations where some areas of the market look stretched. And so given the fact that mortgage rates look like they are going to continue to be low, you can actually see an argument for house prices for the time being remaining at the levels that they were, but you're actually dealing with a much more select group of people who are able to buy. So you've effectively got house prices sustained while there's no outside forced sales from repossessions or anything like that. And so actually you could see prices ticking up a couple of percent, ticking down a couple of percent, but the real big factor that will be affected will be transactions. And so you could then see a scenario where actually prices remain relatively unadjusted, but transactions are quite substantially lower than the 1.2 million we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years. That's obviously then without factoring in any significant economic factor. And then the question then is, when the forbearance then runs out, do you then see a big downturn in house prices as people are forced to sell their homes?
So, I mean, I agree with you, Neil. I just think there's a couple of things that we need to bear in mind. One is that even for those who haven't lost their jobs, quite a lot of them will be affected, at least in some way, because the bonuses will be lower for most people, or any variable pay. And there'll still be this worry of being made redundant later on, because if you look at the output, 99% of businesses would have made less money over the last few months, and that would in some way translate into either lower pay or higher uncertainty. So when it comes to job security, we are likely to see people more worried, even if they still have more money, and they're also likely to have in some way a little bit less money, even if they still have jobs. So overall, I would expect to see some pent-up demand. So we have seen a rise in inquiries, etc., in the housing market. But I think this is very much a pent-up demand of people that have to move. And where we are likely to see potentially a big increase in transactions is if we are seeing, unlike what Adam is trying to tell us, if we are going to see a structural change, that people are generally rethinking where they live and what they need. So maybe they would want to move out of further away from work, because they're thinking of commuting less, they want bigger space. And that's when we're likely to see much, much bigger turnover. But that's probably, we're talking at least a year from now. And just very, very quickly on the implication of a housing market correction. So this is a health shock, and we are going through dealing with that health shock in terms of the economics implication of it. If we have on top of it a housing market correction, given that the UK economy is very vulnerable, very sensitive to the housing market, not just because we have a high proportion of people that own properties here, but also because of the confidence factor as well that is related to that, that would undoubtedly trigger another recession in the UK potentially next year. So that is a big risk for us here, partially also because there's not much the government or the Bank of England can do, because they are already using all their ammunition to try and fight off this crisis. So if we have another one on top of it next year because of the housing market, it will be tough to get out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the scenario that I was laying out has massive risks, and it's not actually that unlike what has been happening to London over the last few years. We've actually seen the London housing market stagnate, where transactions have been collapsing since 2016, partly due to the changes to the stamp duty regime, as mentioned in one of the questions. And actually what we've had there is prices have needed to readjust, but there's been few forced sales. And so that's really limited the ability of the market to do so. The big question is, are we going to see, with a fairly small, low transaction market, some of these pockets of risk actually have an outsized impact? And the areas that I'm particularly worried about, Yael's already mentioned student housing. There's the build to rent, with its focus on the top end of rental markets in particular areas where, in fact, students would have been a large part of demand in some cases. You've got the impact of Airbnb and short-term lettings markets. And so you could see a real scenario where actually you've got, although the general market continues to operate in a kind of stagnant manner with low turnover and fairly stagnant prices, you actually have these areas where, first of all, rents are deeply negatively impacted, but then that inevitably has a knock-on impact onto house prices before you then even start to factor in the balance of whether people will prefer to live in urban or rural areas going forward.
Thanks all. I'm going to try and wrap in some questions now that we've got coming through, and all of you have touched on elements which relate to some of the questions coming through. So, who are the winners and losers coming through on this? And what kind of government intervention is there? We've already seen intervention come through to the lettings market for typically buy-to-let investors, and they were suffering pre-lockdown. And so, how do we see that recovering and coming forward? What intervention does there need to be? So what do government need to do in order to take this forwards and to make it work? How does it impact on things like institutional investment? How does it impact on the buy-to-let investor? And what levers do government have left? And back to your point, Yael, isn't the low interest environment something that's going to help the market through recovery? Or is that the last lever that we used to have, which we no longer have? So perhaps, Yael, do you want to start with that wider picture and government intervention? What can we do to try and re-stimulate, especially if we end up with what sounded like a sort of almost a W-shape recovery, where things might get better and then get taken back down again by either a second lockdown or perhaps a housing as a primary stimulatory to a second recession?
Mm. As well as Brexit. I mean, Brexit could be that second dip next year. So I'd say just government can do a lot of things, but there's a limit to how much it can do in terms of stimulating the economy when you have businesses that still can't operate at full capacity because of social distances, and people are spending because of the uncertainty, etc. So there's definitely stuff on upskilling, on the improving infrastructure, especially around telecommunication and stuff. But thinking more specifically about the housing market, I think one of the things the government can do is try and remove some of these measures that are making the housing market much more rigid. And one of the, the typical one is stamp duty. You do want people to be much more flexible so they can move about and have 2 new jobs much more easily, and also reevaluate their needs in terms of housing much easier. So stamp duty is one of the things that will be a really good measure to make things much more agile in the housing market and ensure that transactions continue to flow. And then on letting, I think quite similarly that, and I'm not thinking so much on buy to let, but actually on people that may want to let their main residence and move elsewhere and work for a few years and then go back. So some sort of allowance for people who are letting their prime residence and not buying something else, just letting the prime residence move for a few years and then going back to where they were before would also be very useful in terms of making it easier for people to move about.
Does the other panelists want to comment on that? Because we've got a stream of questions coming through, which I'd like to share about. So if you've got
Alex, why don't I'll jump in, but perhaps try and link in with I think what I'm seeing in some of the questions. Just thinking about the government response, these responses, I think, are it's always naive to think about them in isolation. They need to be seen through the lens of the government of the day and the policy priorities that exist. And clearly, the Tory aspirational home ownership narrative hasn't disappeared. I would encourage and believe strongly that narrative needs to open up to the full breadth of tenures, private renting and social renting, in order to be truly representative of societal need, but that's a rabbit hole maybe for another day. The point that I want to make is that in terms of driving new housing supply, you can see really important struts of support to continue to pivot away from on the rental market the sort of the buy-to-let story towards a more institutional base of ownership at a longer term income stream perspective. I entirely agree with Neil. The sector will have to mainstream in terms of its pricing against the norm in order to be palatable for government and in order to be frankly appropriate for societal needs. So for me, there's a really important shift which is already taking place, but will be encouraged, and I think for the protagonists in the space will accelerate. You will see, I think, some stronger support. Of course, there was a question about Help to Buy. It was really, really important in 2013, and I wouldn't want to suggest anything otherwise. It should have had a stay of execution, which it didn't have, and it overstimulated, in my view, the housing market. So a reinvigorated version of Help to Buy, I think, is likely, is pragmatic from government. It certainly generated lots of new homes, but ultimately will come with some restrictions. And I hope those restrictions are related to some of the other policy priorities around higher quality homes, more sustainable design. Lots of rhetoric at the moment around the quality of design and community, which is really important. And of course, specific support for the SME builders to maintain diversity in our build programs. So perhaps just finish by focusing back on a couple of comments which directly relate to affordability. And I think there's a big opportunity for government to steer into a storyline or a narrative around supporting a new program of social construction, social housing construction, or affordable rent, in the way that we've sort of broken all the rule books with respect to fiscal spend. There's now, I think, a much more open potential conversation to restart a much more robust social housing program or affordable housing program directly from government, working with housing associations and perhaps independently. And that opportunity, I think, under fiscal restraints and under austerity was clearly much harder to achieve than it is today when the rule books have been torn up. And if you go to the really extreme end, wouldn't it be a really nice positive come out of such a negative that with respect to homelessness, we truly do end homelessness? We proved that it was possible 3 months ago when 5,400 individuals were taken off the street and put into safe and secure accommodation. Wouldn't it be an amazing outcome for such a torrid time for the planet if in fact we made that permanent? It feels to me well within the capability and, dare I say it, the responsibility of government to make that ambition achievable.
Adam, that's a brilliant segue into sustainability, and it was raised on one of the questions, and you touched on it yourself earlier. Is this a situation that we can see? And one of the questions that's come through on the Q&A section, I don't know if any of you have seen it. You touched on space and people's choices and preferences. Do we think that this is likely to accelerate investments into sustainability? And to what extent is affordability? There's a question from someone who works in a housing charity where, are businesses prepared to forego profit in order to create things on a higher, either on affordability point of view for occupiers in that affordable housing world? And how important is that factor of profitability for market growth and market stimulation, given where we're starting from at the moment? And sustainability was pre-lockdown, and I have to say I'm very excited about where we got to as a sector and possibly as a nation in promoting sustainability. Both the E, S and the G seem to be at the forefront of people's minds and taking things forward. Is lockdown, is COVID going to put us backwards in terms of it, or are we going to see a recovery that is going to further promote it? And this is an opportunity to press the reset button, whether it's on people's lives, on where they work and where they live, and that potential impact on space. But how do the panel feel about sustainability and the impact on how we're going to go forwards with it? And I don't know who wants to go first.
I'll start off. I think there's also a question around the housing shortage, and irrespective of whether you believe in the housing shortage or you don't believe in the housing shortage, the one thing that's clear from the stats is that the homes that we have at the moment are going to have to last for an incredibly long time. The rate of demolition means that the average lifespan of the home now is probably in the region of around 2,000 years, and so the sustainability and the quality and everything of new homes is very important, but equally tackling the chronically poor quality housing we have in particularly the private rented sector, but right across all tenures, is incredibly important. And so actually, in terms of tying it together with a government stimulus package, actually something around funding to enable the improvement of the private rented stock could be quite a significant package to to boost spending and to across a range of sectors, and while improving the sustainability, the energy efficiency, and everything of the UK's housing stock.
Yeah, I agree. I think the government will be looking at ways to stimulate the economy and increase employment, while at the same time improving the environment. And this is really a no-brainer. So I think there will be more on that in the short term at least.
Yeah, just to finish, Alex, I know that we're short on time, so I'll be relatively quick. But the UK has signed up to very clear Paris climate change goals. They haven't changed, and in fact, coincident with that, I think, has been a much stronger stepping up from the real estate community. The ESG narrative that you mentioned predates COVID-19, and then has accelerated, in my view, through COVID-19, particularly the S in environmental, sustainable, and governance. We've become more rounded in our view of ESG. And I don't think it's directly a cause of the COVID-19 impact that we will see more adoption of sustainable mindsets and purpose. But I think it has reinforced the need, the desire from society, the desire from your colleagues and mine to be a part of something more than just a profit-making machine blindly. So actually doing something purposeful will be a big part of what drives real estate going forward. And there are absolutely sectors where, in so doing, you can also create more resilient businesses and stronger longer-term commercial businesses as a byproduct. That all, for me, is encouraging news.
Thanks, Adam. Some interesting questions that have come through on planning. And so I'd quite like to just touch on that if we can. I appreciate that you're all economists in most of your views. So do we think that there's going to be a relaxation on planning as part of you mentioned it's a bit of a no-brainer on certain elements from a sustainability point of view. Does the same thing apply to planning? Are we going to see a relaxation on planning to try and stimulate? We've got an aspiration for 300,000 homes, and every time I look at the figure, it seems to increase year on year that I've been involved with this, and we never seem to be achieving it. So we don't seem to get there. Are we going to see brownfield development? Is there going to be some kind of government stimulus from a planning point of view to enable us to try and achieve some of those goals? Or do you not see that as being a positive thing if it is going to come? And what would you do if you were at the helm and you had control on the tiller? Should we start with Neil this time?
Yeah, sure. I think we should absolutely not be tearing up the planning system. Planning is incredibly important and plays a very positive role in the creation of places, but we could do it a lot better. And the single most important thing would be actually to pay far more people to do it in local authorities. And the challenge is that it looks like we're going to be entering a period where we're going to be tearing up some of the rules, deregulating, and that could come with some benefits, but it could also come with some real negatives. And we've seen sectors like the permitted development rights where we've really squeezed the living conditions of people, and it's had some really quite negative outcomes for people. I can't bear to think about some of the people who've been stuck in some of these tiny windowless flats over this period. And so, we have to be very, very careful in terms of what we're doing. And, last year, 2019, we probably added about 250,000 new homes in England. And actually, that's probably about enough when you actually look at it hard. We don't need 300,000. We'd be far better off ensuring that we're building 250,000 in the right places, of the right type, quality and affordability, probably more towards the very affordable end, so social housing and things like that. But we need to be very, very careful about what we do in this period, because there's the real risk of getting it very wrong.
I agree, actually. I think, unlike Adam, I think we may still see a significant change in people's preferences as to where they're going to live and where the key activities are. And therefore, we need to be a bit careful before we start building too many white elephants, essentially, in the wrong places. And I think there's also much more, we need to be much more ambitious about how we refit and use existing housing stock rather than start looking at brownfields and greenfields instead.
Some good points there, and I'll just again be quite quick, Alex. I've got a sort of a tug and pull answer, which is to say that the planning system doesn't need in any way to be ripped up. It needs clarity. We need decisions that can be made based on hard evidence and not subject to the whims of local council and qualitative factors that are populist rather than appropriate for what society needs. And that for me is about clarity rather than changing the rules. That may not be ultimately what we get, but it's certainly what I think we need. The mitigator is that urban environments are going to change relatively rapidly over the next cycle, and we will need to be able to Neil's point, manage some of the change of use that will take place, and do that in a way that doesn't undermine the fundamental rights and interests and quality of life of the future occupiers in whatever form that takes. So the planning system will need to become more robust with respect to fairly significant change of use. And I think that's going to be a real marker of success, whether we get that story right.
Thanks, everybody. We have got more questions pouring in, but I am going to draw matters to a close because we're already a few minutes over. So apologies for those of you that have got meetings that were scheduled to take place at 11:45. And again, apologies to both my daughter and those on the call for stealing her computer and for being late to the start of this. I've taken some real positives out of this, where there is potentially a real opportunity for us within the sector to do something quite interesting in housing, both from a sustainability point of view, an environmental point of view, but also in an affordable world as well. And it sounds like this could be a real opportunity for the sector to do something quite interesting and quite dynamic, albeit we all have challenges that we face with our existing models, but those that adapt the best will certainly come out and be able to change things. So a huge thank you to the three of you for giving up your time and for sharing your thoughts with us. It's much appreciated. And thank you to the 157 people that have dialed in to the call. I hope you found it useful, and I hope we can do something similar to this again, because it's been fascinating for me. So thank you very much for taking part, everybody. And thanks,
Alex.
Thank you.